Thank you. Sorry about that. I'll try again. And I do apologize for the fact that I'm a very tiny woman. So I hate these things, because you won't be able to see me if I stand behind it. And that would be very impolite, so do apologize for me for standing besides. Plus it also fits well with our Nordic, rather democratic fashions. Basically, please let me introduce my Right Honourable Professorial colleague, Dick Sandström. Barry. Sorry, losing my own language now. With whom I work at Linnaeus University in Sweden, together on this research initiative on life at home and sustainable production, kindly, generously supported by IKEA. Basically, he's a professor of wood products at our university, so he actually knows something about this instead of me. I come from business studies background, so do forgive me for my technical depth of ignorance when it comes to wood production. Right. What we're experiencing now is several shifts in the markets, and this is something that we've seen over the last few years, and these are certainly something that's happening in the consumption side. First of all, basically, one thing that gets forgotten when we talk about consumption, and in this kind of conferences, we don't always talk about the consumption side. We tend to focus on the production. It's inherited in business studies and technology studies, so perhaps we should put more emphasis on just looking at what happens in consumption. Just simply put, consumption is not something we live for. This is often forgotten. It's a very simple fact, life. But we forget it. Basically, consumption takes place and is embedded in the practices of living. Usually, when we talk about large consumption habits, they are embedded in everyday living, life of millions and hundreds of millions and billions of people. Now, that is a very important message I have, is just to remind you that consumption is embedded in everyday life. So when we look at how consumption changes, we have to look at the changes in everyday life, and everyday life is always local. Right. That's a very important part. What happens in the consumption side and the everyday life side, we're actually moving from material to immaterial consumption. That means basically that we consume the ideas of good life, what we would see as a desirable life, what would we see as a desirable futures for us. Basically, we don't only do those things, but we also consume the ideas, and that is something that you can see in the media realm all over the place. Even many of you are now embarking on your digital realms, and basically through that kind of media economy or mediaist existence seems to be touching upon the lives of millions and millions and more people today. Basically, it doesn't change our life into a material existence. But this immateriality and these immaterial realms change our relationship to the material. And that's more important. So how do we feel and how do we relate to the material cultures is something that's of much interest and very important part of consumption patterns. Third aspect is local practices. Living is always local, living our lives. But basically these local practices of everyday living transport through media, for example, media trends, to global audiences who can actually consume and actually follow this kind of development. And this is something that we see in large scale lifestyle media, for example, that has been for the last 20 years or so, our largest single growing media genre, for example. So life and living at home is not just actually living and doing the everyday stuff, but we also consume increasingly lifestyles, living at home, and the related media contents and services. And particularly this can be seen in US and Europe in particular, also increasingly other parts of the world. Technologies and consumer participation. This is one of my favorite subjects, of course, is that basically we see now through this kind of when we talk about media, we don't talk about just content, we talk about media as platform, as structure for a negotiation and engagement. And basically that's something we see in many other areas of life, of single consumers or groups of consumers getting actively involved in world in different ways through mediaized technologies. It's a very important aspect. And that kind of links the everyday local practices to global audiences and then back again to local. Now how can this shift be kind of seen in when we talk about woods, woodlands and forests? It's just a picture showing some of the practices that kind of shift that we've seen in Northern Europe. As you probably know, the largest single wildernesses and forest areas in Europe are situated largely in the north, and that's where we come from. So Nordic countries are very wood-intensive cultures altogether, and has been that for a long time. If you look at on the right-hand side, on all the black and white pictures, it tells about the past. It tells about our lifestyle about 100 years ago, or let's say 100 to 130 years ago. Forest was our single biggest life. So living from the forest was the single biggest area of livelihood in the areas where we come from. Basically, that would mean that part of the agricultural culture would be the forestry. So basically, we would get from fishing, from turning forest into farmland, from fishing, picking berries, picking mushrooms, what comes out of the forest. That was very important part of staying alive. Basically, it would have been unthinkable to stay alive without this kind of the use of the land, and that's a very important part of our past. If you look at what happens today, is woods and the forests are a very, very important part of what we see as leisure time activity, recreational activities, and also spending time with family and friends. So basically, berry picking, mushroom picking, going into the forest, going camping, and doing other leisure time activities are often connected to forests. Basically, also fishing and hunting, which are more in the area of sports than on livelihoods nowadays. So, if you look at it over the period of 130 years or so, our relationship to woods has changed dramatically and completely. We connect with the forest on our everyday life on voluntary basis. Many of us get our livelihood from industries connected to forestry and other connected industries, but basically we don't live from the forest the same way we did just over 100 years ago, or less. That has changed completely our relationship. That sense that forest is a leisure, it's good, it's an important part of our culture, has changed our relationship also to the materials that come from the forest in the consumption side. It means different things in our culture today as it did before. At this point, I move word to my colleague Dick, who talks about the sustainable production and the change in that over the last, or similar kind of period, 100 years or so.
Thank you. This is just a very simplified picture of how you use the forest today. About half the forest we take to the foam mill, the rest the paper industry are using for different products. And very, very, very small volume we use for fire. It's landowners that use it for heating their own houses. It looks about the same in Northern Europe in total. This is figures from Sweden, exactly, if you're interested. We will look 100 years back. You see about the same sawmilling. The new is that we had a paper mill industry or a pulp mill industry coming. So we have no pulp, but we have a lot of firewood. What happened, of course, we have a lot more forest, and also we use a lot more forest. And the big shift we have seen here have come in the boxes. We have gone from use of products for their own life to very industrialized processes. Today we have industry, we don't have had it for 100 years ago, more or less. Okay.
Right, we'll go back to, because that was mainly to do with the volumes in the sense of the forestry and forestry use. Basically, this is just an example of a case, because I wanted to use, to present some cases that we see, because we talk about the future. So what does the future look like? Is the future just projections of what has happened before, or are there some significant breaks? It's an interesting question to ask, the whole relationship of the consumption to the forests in Europe, in the US, to a large extent, has changed dramatically over the last 100 years, well, less than 100 years in most places. So basically, but the use, what is the use actually in the forest, that hasn't changed so dramatically. So are we going to see changes in that? That's an interesting question. Here's another case done by some colleagues in Finland, by Finland Futures Research Centre. We're looking at the visions of what the forestry sector, or what they call Finnish bioeconomy business, would look like in the future. This is just one vision, so you know it's always wrong, because predictions are always wrong. But basically, if 10% is right, that will be interesting. Basically, so this is how, and this was actually produced, this work through a whole series of engaging everyone, basically, coming from academic side, coming from industry side, coming from voluntary sector, coming from governmental bodies, to actually in large scale futures process on what does it look like in the future. And this is the results of that process. It's rather interesting. First of all, and remember, this is about business levels, so it's not about production volumes. So one of the new business levels, one could say, the ones that we didn't used to consider, is living trees. Sounds like a simple thing, but basically are non-cut forests and woodlands, and is focusing on the services that can be provided without cutting down the trees at all. Basically, areas where you can provide income from day one. The classical ones are, of course, game hunting, berries, mushrooms, and the tourism, and not just ecotourism. Just about in our areas is almost all tourism is linked to woodlands in one way or another. But also these new ways of participation in ways, in forms of, for example, carbon sinks, that forest owners can rent their forests for families and individuals half across the world to work as their private carbon sinks, through which they can contemplate on their own use of natural resources and actually link that to very specific areas or even specific trees, should one want to. And this is what the new technologies allows us to do. So this is a completely new vision for that, linking this to forestry.
And we can say that the big challenge for forestry is to link to tourism. We have to link this together. You can't use the old way of managed forest any longer. And that will change very quickly, I think, in Sweden and Finland particularly. Number 2, we have wood products. That is the usual way of solid wood, and it will be there in the future. The requirements on it will be changed quite a lot, from volume to specific requirements on properties, like you had shape stability, durability, strength, of course. That is important to have in the wood, especially in wood that have been grown for hundreds of years. But the most valuable part, I think, will be in the future. That is the aesthetical part of wood, or the tactile part of wood. There we will see the money of the wood. The other part is just, we must have them. Fiber and pulp products. In traditional pulp or fiber paper products in Northern Europe, we'll see the last few minutes now. It will not be there any longer. The price is too high, the markets are changing, and our forest is too expensive to use. It takes, in the south part of Sweden, 100 years from planting to felling, and in the north it's 150 to 200 years. So we can't use it in this way. But what we see now, the new products, it's growing very fast. So new products, it's new process in industrialized. It's, for example, dissolving pulp for textile products, like this, is coming very fast. The old pulp mills changing to different products, but it's still the same factory. Polymers and chemicals. We all know that in a tree you can find hundreds of chemicals, and you can have hundreds of ways to use the fiber in a different way. And we have just picked the first low-hanging fruit from this part of products. We will see, as an example, we have this, call it interlayer cellulose, the parts or microfibrils of the cellulose. How we use paper from that is strong as carbon fiber, a real high product. And we have the lignin, that's the half of the wood, more or less. We have not used it very much, we burn it today. We have this new process in the kraft lignin process, and we have a kraft pulp process. And we use another process to get another type of lignin. Then we can use it for adhesives, for different, like a chemical instead of the oil products. Bioenergy, there we have to, all products we take from the forest, 100% will go back in one or another way to energy. That don't mean that we have to burn it all the time. We have the gasification process to make fuel for cars, for example. We have several plants in Nordic countries that are trying to get the most economical way for this part. And yes, we can stop.
Yes, basically the biggest shifts that we see here is probably in the fiber and pulp. Now when the paper mills are turning into Google and Facebook server mills, and slowly and basically waiting for the graphics arts industry to immigrate east and south. We see huge changes there. But in all of these, you can see different value change. But the real challenge is how to create value change that basically link these different business levels. It is pretty obvious, but if we start burning this up north, in Northern Europe, it will kill the previous 1 to 4 levels. But if we look from top to bottom instead of bottom to top, we can actually increase significantly. Yeah, right.
Few minutes.
Yeah, a few minutes, which is rip up. Basically, what a vision from the Northern European woods would be in this kind of sort of visionary thinking would be making it possible to work on the value before the timber is cut, before the wood material is taken out of the forest of the living wood. There's huge big potential there.
And by the processes we have to sell the tree many times, and 100 times it's a good guess we have to sell it.
So there is the time aspect. Within 100 years, we can't wait for 100 years. We have to find ways how to increase the income or business value from day one.
Yes.
And adding services is exactly that kind of thing. Basically, what we want to conclude with is just with the old science fiction classic, for those of you who might be interested in literary endeavors, of William Gibson. The future is here. It's just not widely distributed yet. It seems like in the future of the forest, different parts of the world are moving very different pace and a different pace in the processes, and also historically. And I think even though we talk a lot about globalization, the consumption is always in the local practices. So the future of your future might be already somewhere else, or it might be also something that's being passed somewhere else. And that's good to remember.
Just as we said, income from day one is the first point we have to fix in some way. We have this linkage between the forestry and the tourism, I can call it. And the last one, today we have different industries. We have the sawmills, we have pulp and paper mills, we have the energy industries. We have to concentrate them to one place, one factory system, so we can optimize the process in a totally different way that we do today. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. And I understand we get questions at the end of the session.